And I will introduce Tegan Kehoe, who is the Research and Adult Program Director.
Morning, Deb.
I beg your pardon? At the Paul Revere Memorial Association. Tegan, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, take it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sharon and Sandy and the Bedford Historical Society, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. So I am from the Paul Revere Memorial Association, which is the nonprofit that owns and operates the Paul Revere House Museum. And my presentation today is the story behind Paul Revere's ride and more. So I'll be talking a bit about his life, a little bit about his kind of context within the American Revolution. And please do feel free to put questions in the meeting chat. If I'm able to keep up with them, I'll answer them as I go, and otherwise I'll save some time at the end. So, because the weather is on all of our minds, I do want to start by kind of situating us in Paul Revere's lifetime. So, he was born at the tail end of 1734. Actually, there had previously been some debate about whether he was born December 1734 or January 1st, 35. It's now known that he was born in 34, and he died in 1818. So, he had a good long life. And he lived at the tail end of what's called the Little Ice Age. So this was a period of time that was both before human-made climate change, but was also a period of natural climate change in the sense that it was colder. And so thinking about Paul Revere, I like to think about, and thinking about his family, I like to think about any weather that we're getting. He would have been getting a slightly colder version, maybe a slightly snowier version, heating his home by firewood. Uh, it's believed that the approximate volume of the firewood you would need to heat a colonial home was the volume of the home over again. Now, you wouldn't own all of that firewood all at once. If you were living in town, like in Boston, you would be buying it from outside of town and then burning it and buying more. If you lived somewhere where you had land, you might be cutting it down as you're using it. But just to give a little context, I'm happily drinking my tea, being glad that we're not currently boycotting tea, and very, as much as I would love to visit Paul Revere's time, it's very pleasant to be on this Zoom call with all of you hopefully everyone is in a heated home at the moment. So with that little piece of context, I do want to introduce Paul Revere. So here are two depictions of Paul Revere, and we've got one that's a little bit more fantastical than the other. And so the one where he is sitting at his silversmith bench, this is a Copley portrait, John Singleton Copley, who was one of the most important portrait artists of his day. And this was painted when Revere was in his mid-30s. He was a silversmith. He learned his trade from his father. And it was very unusual for someone who was having their portrait painted to be from the laboring classes at all. I mean, Revere was an artisan. He was very skilled, but he's someone who worked with his hands. He's not someone who was of the sort of the gentry class at the time. Very few of them had their portraits painted, and if they did, they certainly wouldn't be at their workbench like this. So this is really kind of a unique portrait from the time. And there are a lot of theories as to why either Copley chose to portray him this way or Revere himself asked to be portrayed at his trade. But there isn't really definitive evidence as to why that would be. Then on the other side here, we have a 20th century illustration of Paul Revere's ride. And you probably recognize some things in this illustration, even if you haven't seen this one before. We've got Paul Revere on a horse. We don't see his face, but he's got the tricorn hat and he's got the horse, so of course it's Paul Revere. He's looking back at the lantern signals coming from Old North Church. And sometimes people will point out when they see this picture, he's in a powdered wig, so he looks upper class, and he's tall and thin, which we think is just because Americans tend to like our heroes tall and thin. The real Paul Revere was kind of an average height and stocky guy. And so here are two Paul Reveres, both of which have some elements that we know are accurate, but they tell very different parts of his story. And the 20th century version also has some elements of myth, and we'll be talking about that as we get into the ride itself. To set the scene a little bit, so I've already introduced you to Boston in the 18th century via its weather, but here we have Boston around the time of Revere's birth, or even before. His father had been from France. His father immigrated. His father was named Apollo Revere, later anglicized his name to Paul Revere, so famous Paul Revere is a junior. And young Apollo Revere was born in France to Protestant parents at a time when it wasn't very comfortable to be a Protestant in France. They sent their child to live with an uncle in Guernsey in one of the Channel Islands. And after about a year there, the uncle arranged an apprenticeship for the boy. It was with a very prominent silversmith, very skilled. So in many ways, this was a pretty choice apprenticeship. This is a labor contract, but it's also giving him an education that would hopefully set him up for life. The catch was that this apprenticeship was in Boston. We don't know how much English the young boy spoke. He appears to have come here, completely by himself, didn't know anyone in Boston. And this bustling but somewhat provincial port town is what he would have arrived to. So Apollo Revere did become a silversmith, became a very well-regarded silversmith. He married a woman, Deborah Hitchborn, whose family was English, and they had been here a few generations. They were of the merchant class. They were a little more well-to-do than Revere. And as I mentioned, as a young adult, he did anglicize his name. And later the family would say it was because it was how the bumpkins here were pronouncing it anyway. So he became Paul Revere. And then his eldest son was our Paul Revere, who also became a silversmith. So at the time, the training for being a silversmith was an apprenticeship. So our Revere had the equivalent of about a 7th or 8th grade education, and then his trade education on top of that. He wasn't much of an original artist. Most of the work that he was doing, he was copying designs in design books, that sort of thing. That was to be expected in silversmiths at the time, and he was very good at adapting to different styles. So here's an example of a teapot that he did. And his silver work ranged from the very elaborate to the fairly quotidian. So he did belt buckles, he did, basic teaspoons and that sort of silverware. But he also did elaborate multi-piece tea sets. Many of these were commissions. And he did some fairly unusual objects as well. He kept pretty meticulous records, so we are able to know, individual pieces that he made and for whom. Those records are in the Massachusetts Historical Society today. And so we know that he did some things like he made a dish out of an ostrich egg by creating a silver foot for that egg. He made a silver chain for someone's pet squirrel. Pet squirrels were not particularly more common than they are today, but someone hired him to do this. And so he was a pretty versatile silver artist in that way. Here's an example of his most famous, arguably most famous piece of silver, which is called the Liberty Bowl. It's in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston today. And this is a large punch bowl. And this was a commission from a group of patriots who were commissioned it in order to honor a group of patriots who were part of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, who chose not to rescind a letter that the House had written in protest of the Townshend Acts. So one of the series of taxes that was controversial because we didn't have representation in Parliament. So no taxation without representation. You probably remember, if you remember, only one or two things about the American Revolution. And so many of the different issues that Revere became involved with, either directly as a patriot and activist and indirectly as someone taking commissions from people who are involved, are in one way or another revolving around that. So the people rescinding or not rescinding that open letter will come up again later in the presentation. But this bowl, as I mentioned, it's very large. Many people kind of associate it with Paul Revere, not just because he made it, but because it is this Patriot artifact. He actually took commissions from both sides of the political divide. And the political divide, he kind of came of age with this division. It really started to heat up in the 1760s when he was a young man. He had fought in the French and Indian War. His father actually died when Revere was 19, and he was in an awkward position of not being old enough to legally inherit the family silversmith shop. But he was the eldest son and trying to, see what he could do to both provide for himself, but also hopefully provide for his mother and siblings. And so he did what many people in his position, at the time and at other times did, and enlisted. And the French and Indian War was really a catalyst for many people, partly because of feelings of resentment between soldiers who felt like the expertise on the ground was being ignored and all the decisions are coming from across the Atlantic. And then afterwards, the royal government really started to have the colonies essentially pay for this war through those taxes. Many colonists, especially if you're, on the water in Boston, kind of saw it as a border war and didn't feel that it was directly ours. And so being forced to pay for this war through taxation that we didn't have a say in, and it didn't feel like our war, led to a lot of the struggles that would become heated starting in the late 1760s and then, of course, explosive by the 1770s. In the 1770s, the economy in Boston was pretty tumultuous. It was going up and down. Revere at this point is an adult with a growing family himself, and silversmithing is a trade that is definitely valued in the community, but it's not necessarily one that is sustainable in all economies. Silver is a lot of the time a luxury good, so people are buying silver when money is flush. But silver was also considered a form of wealth storage at the time. People who were fairly middle class might buy a nice silver piece, hand it down as an heirloom if they could, but melt it down or sell it if they came on hard times. This is before banks as we know them. And so while middle class people are buying silver, if the economy is lean, they're not buying silver. Very few people are. And I'm using that to jump off into the idea that Revere actually ends up kind of sidelining his silversmith business a little bit, and he ends up taking on a lot of different side jobs. One of them was as an engraver. So he's engraving copper plates for printing presses, and that was something where he was really able to translate his skills as a silversmith into this different medium. One of the things he did as an engraver was make political cartoons, and in that case, he is not taking commissions from both sides of the conflict. He was only making cartoons for the political side that he agreed with, which was the Patriot side. So this is an example of one of his cartoons, and a lot of political cartoons from this era are really dense with symbolism, and some of that symbolism is very, very specific to the time. Sometimes cartoons at the time would even include labels to make sure that people understood, in this version, the pig is this guy, from Parliament or something like that. This particular cartoon, I think, doesn't need a lot of expertise in the symbolism of the time. We've got more demon-like creatures forcing a lot of people in colonial garb into the mouth of some kind of hellhound with flames coming from its mouth. The title of the cartoon is A Warm Place, Hell. He's telling this group of people that they can go to hell. Now, the group of people here are the members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives who did rescind that open letter that was a protest on taxation without representation. So I mentioned with the Liberty Bowl that particular event was going to come back. So this is a cartoon about that issue. Revere's other side businesses included being a part-time dentist for a little while, which is something you could do at the time, part-time. And later on, he briefly opened a hardware store. And then after the Revolution, he was involved in kind of early industry and had a couple of factories going, and I'll talk more about that when we get there chronologically. But in addition to his businesses, Revere had a lot of other things going on in his life. He was a churchgoer. He did a little bit of church hopping, but mostly he was at the New Brick Church, which was Congregationalist. They're, the descendants of the Puritans. At the time, Congregationalist was, part of what we would consider mainline Protestantism today. And certainly in New England, there are still Congregationalist churches, which are a little bit different from the Congregationalist churches of Revere's time. He was also a Freemason, and that's part of why I have this slide up when talking about his community activities. Freemasonry, as you may know, because it's still around today, is a fraternal organization for men that is largely about community and friendship and character building. And in Revere's time, it was a very popular organization, and it was widely popular among people who ended up being pretty active in the American Revolution. A number of founding fathers were Freemasons. In this period, the Freemasons were really interested in things we consider Enlightenment ideals. So this late 18th century political philosophy that valued things like democracy and people having a voice in their government, which was a really dramatic departure from the kind of medieval and Renaissance kind of hierarchy of society. Freemasonry was pretty meritocratic once you met certain requirements. So if you were, at the time that Revere joined, you had to be a white man. There weren't any official property requirements. So it's actually available to a wider group of society than voting was at the time, because there were property requirements for voting. You did have to be able to afford lodge dues and that sort of thing, so it really wasn't everyone. And you had to believe in the Christian God. Excuse me, my almost 4-year-old has woken from her nap early, so there's a little commotion behind me. Sorry, I'm mildly distracted there. But Freemasons were meritocratic in the sense that if you were a member and you worked hard and applied yourself and participated, you were likely to be able to really rise up within the ranks and hold a leadership position if you wanted one, which is really not how colonial society at the time worked. Massachusetts, very much like England at the time, was a very class-based society, and social and economic mobility was extremely restricted. For a man like Paul Revere, who had grown up with fairly modest means, they weren't necessarily poor, but they were working with their hands for a living. He had that, trade education. The Freemasons was a really cool opportunity to be able to get ahead by applying himself. And so that's what he did. And he did rise within the ranks, held a number of leadership positions. And it also enabled him to have collegial and in some cases really warm and friendly relationships with people from other social classes. So he ends up kind of mixing with some of the wealthier Harvard-educated patriots who were in on the kind of the political workings of the revolution. And the lodge that he belonged to, the Lodge of St. Andrew, owned the Green Dragon Tavern, which is what's pictured here. And the Green Dragon Tavern is now a little bit famous because it is believed to be the place where the meetings were held leading up to the Boston Tea Party. So someone mentioned Benjamin Carp's book, The Defiance of the Patriots, earlier. Really fun book. Carp is one of the many historians who is sure that Paul Revere participated in the Boston Tea Party, if I remember correctly. And we at the Paul Revere House are actually a little bit more conservative in our thinking in terms of how we're analyzing the evidence. We don't have great documentation that attests that Paul Revere actually participated in the Tea Party. We would love to say he was there. We're not sure. Quick refresher for anyone who only dabbles in this time period. So the Boston Tea Party is 1773, and it was the culmination of this standoff in which Parliament had recently passed a new tax on tea, actually lowering the total price of tea for the colonists. But this was after a series of protests about taxation without representation, and both sides of the conflict saw this new law as a reassertion of Parliament's right to tax the colonists. There were ships in the harbor that had a number of different types of cargo. Colonists, patriots in particular, had been allowing the ships to unload all of their cargo except the tea. And they were essentially trying to hit the tea merchants where it hurt in their pocketbooks, and enforcing this boycott in Boston and in many other places. And the merchants are also the ones who are likely to be members of parliament or to be, in a social class with the members of parliament. So this is when they didn't have political representation. This is one of the ways they're able to kind of flex their power as a people, the colonists here in Massachusetts. We don't know whether Paul participated because this was a major crime. The culmination in which the Patriots dumped 300 plus crates of tea into Boston Harbor would be worth over $1 million in property damage in today's money. So the participants swore one another to secrecy, and all of the good documentation that we have about who was there was written decades after the fact. Now, Paul Revere was really great at being kind of everywhere and involved in everything, and also giving the impression that he was everywhere and involved in everything. And so he does appear on some of those lists, and we take them with a grain of salt because we can't imagine someone decades later remembering something that he did as a young man, saying, so-and-so was there and so-and-so was there. Was Paul Revere there? Yeah, he was there. He was at everything. We're not sure. However, the next morning, Paul Revere made his first ride as a Patriot messenger, taking the news from Boston to New York that this had happened, essentially trying to get the Patriot version of the story to other colonies, and specifically to New York, before other versions of this event got out. So that was on December 18th, Tea Party 17th, 1773. And it becomes Paul Revere's first ride as a political messenger. This is something else that, for the most part, he did for pay, but he's only taking jobs from the side he agrees with. So he did about a dozen of these in the next year. And then, of course, his most famous ride is April 18th, 1775. As far as we know, he was not paid for that one. But this is kind of, the Boston Tea Party ends up opening this new phase, both in his life and in his patriot activism. So when we picture Paul Revere today, we're often picturing Paul Revere on horseback. He was a skilled rider. A number of newspaper accounts of these courier missions that he was doing, passing messages between often the local committees of correspondence, which were sort of quasi-legal patriot auxiliary groups to the town halls. Newspaper accounts would remark that he was making very good time, that he was very skilled at this. We don't actually know how Paul Revere got good at riding a horse. He grew up in, we think of as a city, was a town at the time, but a very densely populated area in the most densely populated neighborhood of the town. He didn't have the kind of job that would require him to ride a horse. He wasn't, working on a farm or anything like that. And as far as we know, he didn't own a horse until after the Revolution. Riding a horse was a common skill at the time, but not quite as common as, say, driving a car today. So the fact that he could ride isn't remarkable, but it's a bit of a mystery why he got so good. But of course, being good at riding a horse was only one part of why the Patriots, his fellow Patriots, trusted him as a messenger. He was also someone who was, known to a lot of other members of the community. And so he was trusted because he was active in the movement. And so people were willing to trust him with taking these sensitive messages. Before we dive into the midnight ride itself, I do want to mention that by 1775, Paul Revere is 40 years old. About 5 years before, he had purchased a house, the first home that he owned. It was about 5 blocks from where we believe he was born. And it is the house that's still standing today. That's the museum where I work that we call the Paul Revere House. He lived there for about 30 years, so he did live at other Paul Revere houses at different times, but it's the only one that's still standing. And as of the Midnight Ride, he had a number of children from his first marriage. 6 of the children from his first marriage survived early childhood. Sadly, his first wife, Sarah, died in 1773. We don't know how she died. It's not recorded. He remarried fairly quickly, which was common at the time, and his second wife, Rachel Walker Revere, is the woman who's pictured here. We don't have any images that survive of Sarah. Rachel was a pretty admirable person who seems to have risen to every challenge that life and her life as the wife of a Patriot messenger would have thrown at her. She had been an only child, so she didn't have younger siblings or nieces or nephews that she had experience caring for, and this was her first marriage. So she goes from not being a caregiver necessarily at all to raising 6 children, becoming a stepmother, and then she and Paul went on to have an additional 8 children, a couple of whom had already been born at the time of the Midnight Ride. So this is, they are already in the thick of it at the time that this is happening. And we'll talk a bit after the ride about kind of how they weathered the siege of Boston that happened immediately after the ride. So here's another of those Revere engravings. This one's called The Able Doctor, and this is another of the tea protests. And so in the 1770s, things were heating up quickly. It was starting to become more and more likely that this political conflict was going to become a military conflict, but no one knew exactly when or how. And I apologize, this is a slide from a different lecture. I've mixed them up a little bit, but we'll continue on. Here we are to Boston in 1775. This is one of my favorite maps ever, I think, because I just really like it aesthetically and I really like it historically. So in the 19th century, a variety of development projects roughly doubled the amount of land in Boston. So Boston today is unrecognizable if you compare these two maps, or if you compare this map with a map today. The Back Bay neighborhood, for example, was a bay at the time. So you've got, some major Boston landmarks today: Boston Public Library, Museum of Fine Arts. The land that they are on didn't exist yet. Dorchester's down here off of the map. It wasn't part of Boston yet. Most of South Boston was water at the time. So it's this little peninsula connected to the rest of the colony by Boston Neck, which is just one street wide. The Paul Revere House is up here in the north end, geographically the northeast end, which was the main residential neighborhood of Boston at the time. It was a neighborhood that was very economically intermixed. He's living, right next to people of all different social classes. And Royal soldiers were stationed on Boston Common, just about a mile from where Revere was living. As I mentioned, a lot of people thought that this was going to erupt into a war, but no one knew exactly how or when. Revere was one of about 30 people who had organized themselves into a spy ring to observe what the royal forces were doing. This was one of those situations where both sides were spying on one another, and both sides knew that spying was occurring. And so it was really just kind of an intelligence race to pass along and act on messages as quickly as possible. And so Revere's spy ring reported up to 4 leaders, one of whom was Dr. Joseph Warren, and that's the one that Revere worked most closely with. And as far as we can tell, they were personal friends. They had met through Freemasonry, and it seems that they were pretty fond of one another. Now, if you're really interested in the American Revolution, or specifically Boston area history, Dr. Joseph Warren is probably a name you know. If you're not, then that might be an unfamiliar name to you, and that's totally fine. he would have been recognized as one of our founding fathers. Some people say he might have been our first president, except that he died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So his story was cut short. Paul Revere actually later named one of his sons after him, Joseph Warren Revere. But at the time, Joseph Warren was one of the most important patriots, really in New England, and arguably kind of in the whole of the American colonies. One of the other people that this spy ring reported up to was Dr. Benjamin Church, who, again, if this is your area, you already know that name. He later turned turncoat, so not a great person to be reporting your spy activities to. Revere was one of the people who was planning for what would happen if they did get message that that the troops were on the move. And so he and Dr. Warren kind of worked out a plan that Revere would be one of the people to actually get the message out of Boston. He was going to go across the water into Charlestown, so he would be taking a rowboat for that portion of the mission. And then another patriot, William Dawes, was going to go south out Boston Neck. Dawes was a little bit less well known in Boston, but he was, also a friend of the Patriot cause. And they also had a backup system that you have probably heard of, even if you don't know that you've heard of it. The backup system was signal lanterns at the Old North Church. So many people think of Paul Revere as being on the opposite shore, waiting for a message from the Patriots in Boston. In fact, he had already gotten the message by the time he's crossing the water. So this is a contemporary depiction of him crossing the water. There's the royal ship, the HMS Somerset, that they have to avoid while they're in this rowboat with two other patriots. Excuse me. So backing up a moment, when Revere first learned that something was up on the night of April 18th, 1775, someone, we don't know who, knocked on his door and said, go talk to Dr. Warren. He went to Warren's house, who basically said, it's go time to enact the plans we've been preparing. Revere returned to his house, and that's the one that I showed you a slide of, the one that's now a museum. He put on his coats and boot and, kissed his wife goodbye, and they didn't know when they would see one another again. And then he went to Old North Church, talked to a couple of friends who he had been planning this with, and they hung two lanterns in the steeple of Old North Church as a signal to patriots in Charlestown in case Revere and Dawes were both arrested or worse on their way out of town. As you might remember, the code was 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. So those two lanterns meant that the royal soldiers were getting out of town by sea, really by marsh. They're crossing over wetlands into Cambridge, and then they arrived at Lechmere Point, Cambridge, and from there they marched out west to Lexington. And the reason that mattered, it was really a time estimate. This was the shortcut. It would take several more hours to take the long way out Boston Neck. And so as he's trying to, essentially racing to get the message, to get people prepared before the soldiers arrive, they're going the short way across the water here. So he did take a rowboat across to Charlestown, and from there he confirmed that they had received the message. They had already sent another messenger out. That's the last time that messenger appears in the historical record. So we imagine that the messenger sent from Charlestown didn't make it very far. Revere eluded patrols at one point, was almost captured and got away, actually only about a mile from where I am in Somerville. And he did make it to Lexington, and his primary mission was to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that they might be arrested that night. Because they were hiding out in Lexington, and it was very likely that if they were arrested, they would be hanged for treason. You probably know the other goal of the Midnight Ride, because that is the ride that we're at this point. April 18th is the Midnight Ride, and that's to alarm the countryside. to let the Patriots know that this is happening so that the militias, the local militias, including the Minutemen, can be prepared for the possibility of armed conflict. So the Royal soldiers are on their way both to possibly capture Patriot leaders and to capture munitions, to capture weapons and gunpowder being stored in the countryside. We often picture Revere on horseback, shouting kind of town crier style, and people will often, imagine him saying, "The British are coming." Now, you might have been told he probably didn't say the British are coming. We were still British at the time, so that would have been weird. So he might have said the regulars are coming out, which was the name of the type of soldier they were. He wasn't shouting. This is a spy mission. So he's getting off his horse. He's going door to door of people he knows of, especially seeking out people who are Patriot leaders, people who are connectors, people who can spread the message further. And so kind of an 18th century phone tree happens where he's talking to people and they're talking to others as well. Meanwhile, Dawes is on his way, taking the long route. He's not alarming the countryside. He's just trying to get to Hancock and Adams. Both of them arrived in Lexington, and they met up with another Patriot, Samuel Prescott, and decided to go on to Concord, which wasn't actually originally part of the plan. But they decided, they had some more steam in them. They could keep going. But at that point, all three of them were surrounded by British officers. And so that's what the slide on this screen is depicting. The other two got away, but only Prescott actually managed to continue alarming the countryside, spreading the word. Dawes actually, there's various versions of the various accounts. He either fell off his horse or his horse was injured, but he wasn't able to complete, any further message spreading. And Revere was the unlucky one who did not get away, and he was held for questioning for about 2 hours. He was eventually released. He basically wasn't a strategic priority at that point. This is, roughly 4 a.m. in Lexington on April 18th, 1775. And there are troops coming from, at this point, multiple sides, the local militia and the royal troops. But before they released him, the British soldiers confiscated the horse that he had borrowed from a fellow patriot in Charlestown. So he was never able to return that borrowed horse. And then he returned to returned to Lexington on foot in the wee hours of the morning on April 19th. And so he became an ear witness, if not an eyewitness, to the first shots of the American Revolution, because the ultimate culmination of the local forces trying to stop the royal forces from capturing those munitions was the battle on Lexington Green, and then later in the day, the battle in Concord that became the first battles of the American Revolution. So that's Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride, but his story really doesn't end there. About 40 years after his death, Paul Revere became famous for the first time. He had been kind of small-time famous in his lifetime. He was a guy people knew. He had kind of his 15 seconds of fame. His name appeared in London newspapers at one point as one of the messengers for the Patriot movement, but he was not a household name at all during his long life. But in 1860, the Atlantic Monthly came out with, it's actually the January 1861 issue, but like today, magazines often released, several weeks before their official release date. So in 1860 is the first publication of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride. And that poem is the one that kind of created this national icon, Paul Revere. It's where we get the phrase, one if by land, two if by sea. It's where we get many of the images that we have in our minds of what this ride looked like. It's where we get Paul Revere as someone who's acting alone, as this kind of lone figure on horseback, riding into the night. When really he was part of a complex patriot network of people who were creating backup plans for one another, people who were supporting one another, people who were passing messages along. Longfellow was writing this on the eve of the American Civil War. in a time that was similarly tense in the sense that many people believed that the political conflict was about to erupt into a military conflict, but it hadn't yet. And Longfellow, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, definitely supporter of the northern side of the conflict, and he was trying to get his fellow Northerners to take decisive action and trying to inspire them with a hero from history. The other image that I have on this screen is early 20th century, a piece of sheet music that we have in our collection at the Revere House, Paul Revere's March and Two-Step. So that's just one of thousands of pieces of Revereabilia that we've collected, because he really did become this icon, this national hero, and really all posthumously. And so his ride kind of became synonymous with Paul Revere himself. I apologize. My slide deck is not quite where I expected it to be, so I'm just going to quickly switch slide decks because I have more that I want to tell you. So just going to do one thing here, because I do want to tell you about what happens after the battle and after the Midnight Ride. So Paul Revere probably did not return home after the Midnight Ride immediately. He was doing some work for the Patriots outside of Boston, and then he was able to secure lodging for his family in Watertown, so a little bit outside of Boston. And so Rachel Revere had to figure out a way to get the family out of Boston at a time when the options for getting out of town were kind of constantly changing. All right, thank you for your patience. Can everyone see my slide right now, which is a north view of Castle William on the harbor of Boston?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So Revere did join the army again after once the war broke out. Meanwhile, Boston is under siege. They don't know how long it's going to last, but his family ended up being in Watertown for at least 11 months during the siege of Boston. So when we think back to 250th anniversaries, we're all thinking of the anniversary of the founding of the country this summer, but 250 years ago today, the Revere family is kind of in exile, as many Bostonians were at the time, while this siege is going on. Meanwhile, Revere had a fairly uneventful military career. He was in charge of Castle William in Boston Harbor for a period of time. He was given kind of the equivalent of a dishonorable discharge later on after the Penobscot expedition, but then after a trial, he was cleared of the charges. So it was a complicated situation. He didn't come off looking very good, but I think most historians who study it agree that he was really more of a mediocre tactician than a coward and insubordinate, which was the original charges. So once he was able to return to civilian life, I mentioned he had a short-lived hardware store, but then Revere opened a pretty successful bell and cannon foundry. Those were his major products, both bells for churches, town halls, etc., but also cannon and ship fittings and various other things for the military. So he essentially became a weapons contractor. And something that I really personally admire about Revere is that he was very skilled at teaching himself things and translating skills that he had from one training into another area. So these are very different metals that behave very differently in order to be able to work with brass and bronze and create these alloys. And he was able to teach himself a little bit seeking out teachers, but a little bit just teaching himself from books and experimentation, and is able to create this successful business. This is also in the North End in Boston. Here's an example of one of his bells. At least 90 of his bells survive today. Some of them he was personally involved in making, and others he was the supervisor that others were doing the physical labor here. And then in kind of his last phase of life, he opened the country's first successful copper rolling mill in Canton, Massachusetts. So now he's about 20 miles outside of the city. And this is a business he was able to pass on to a couple of his sons, and it did outlive him. And the copper from his copper rolling business in his lifetime, he had a number of high profile projects, including copper for the dome of the Massachusetts State House, copper for siding for the ship USS Constitution. And in this endeavor, he was able to kind of increase his social status as someone who was fairly wealthy as an early industrialist. Not necessarily upper class, but perhaps upper middle class. These two portraits of Paul and Rachel were done late in their lives. They were commissioned by one of their sons, and these are Gilbert Stuart portraits, so another very big name in early American portraiture. And so late in life, Revere was living both in Boston and in Canton. He was kind of supervising his business that he had passed on to a few of his sons. He dabbled in poetry, wrote some very charming little poems about Canton Dale meeting his property in Canton. The other side of that is that he outlived all but 5 of his 16 children and outlived both of his wives. Rachel died about 5 years before he did. And so the end of his life was, also marked by these losses. But he did live to the age of 83 and died in 1818. But of course, for us, that's not the end of the story, because he did become famous after his lifetime. And in the late 19th century, people started noticing that this building that had been Paul Revere's home still stood. It had been added to, it had been taken away from, it had been painted and repainted countless times. The first floor was being used for shops, and the above floors were being rented out to various tenants. Like many businesses in a city where there are kind of multiple functions going on at once. And in 1905, a descendant of Paul Revere's bought the house, gathered together with a number of like-minded, history-minded people, formed a nonprofit that became the Paul Revere Memorial Association, which then raised the funds to reimburse him for the purchased the house from this descendant, and formed the nonprofit that still runs the museum to this day. So we've been a museum since 1908, hired a restoration architect back when there were very few of those in the United States. So from 1907 to 1908, the house was restored as much as possible to kind of a combination of its original character and its character in Paul Revere's time. When Revere bought the house, it had been 90 years old. So there's kind of 2 time periods going on in the Paul Revere house. But that is the Paul Revere House today. We've been a museum for over a century, and our goal is to share Paul Revere's story, but also to share the context, share what Boston was like in his time period, share what it was like to be his wife or his child or his neighbor, and experiencing the American Revolution. So that is, I think, both a lot of detail and kind of a whirlwind tour of Boston at this time. I'm going to stop my screen share now so we can see one another, but I welcome any questions that you have.
I don't have a question, but you had asked about Paul Revere and whether or not you believe that he was part of the Boston Tea Party.
Mm-hmm.
So I had the older book edition of Benjamin Carp.
Mm-hmm.
I showed you before. It's published a while ago, and in the back and the index it says that he was part of the North End Caucus, Sons of Liberty. So he knew my ancestor John Crane, because John Crane used to have the men from Sons of Liberty at his home, which was on Tremont Street. Now it's the Schubert Theater, and I was recently, just as of last month, asked by the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum to come up to their museum to be part of the official unveiling of the participants, because they had vetted all the participants. And I actually have a photograph of all the participants, which if you're interested, I can email to you, or I can text you with it. And I'm looking at the picture right now because I took it right there. And it says participants of the Boston Tea Party. And there's like 128, and they have vetted each one of these individuals. Now, whether or not Paul Revere actually dumped the tea, like my ancestor did not dump the tea, he was in the hold of the ship, and the mechanism broke. So the tea crate hit him in the head.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's what made him famous for the Boston Tea Party. But I'm looking right at it, and it says Paul Revere. But
Yeah.
another thing I found was from the Massachusetts Historical Society. And my John Crane and your Paul Revere are listed as part of the 300 men. It's an alphabetical list of the Sons of Liberty who dined at the Liberty Tree in Dorchester, the 4th of August, 1769, to commemorate the 4th anniversary of the Stamp Act riots that you had previously mentioned. So I, of course, printed it up, and I went, oh my God, Paul Revere's on there. I know that name. So I didn't know if this was very easy to obtain. I just went on Massachusetts Historical Society, and it does a transcript, but also gives you the complete list of all the people that were there that we know from 5th grade social studies. So
right. Yeah, that's very cool.
Very cool. So,
yeah, so we have been in close contact with the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum and with American Ancestors, which is the group they contracted with for that vetting.
I know Lindsay Fulton.
As historians, we always think it's fun when historians disagree, because that's kind of the meat of it, of the work is, analyzing the evidence that's available and, trying to draw conclusions from that. We do disagree a little bit with them on how certain it is that Revere was actually a participant. But we do think that it's wonderful that they're continuing to do this research, because the research is ever evolving. And that document about the commemoration of the Stamp Act, that's really fun.
Yeah, it is really cool. They also in the book have Paul Revere as being on the watch, where they stood on the docks and they wanted to make sure that nobody was unloading the tea, nobody is bribing the dock workers, paying the tax. And that is listed, that is listed in the book.
Yes, no, and we do agree that that's a very probable role for Paul Revere, that his work was often kind of as a liaison between the planners and the doers in these mass actions in the revolution. But again, disagreeing on the certainty of whether it happened. I think Vincent has your hand up.
So, yes, hi, Vince Dixon in Winchester, and I am a historian myself.
Wonderful.
And there's two particular things that I think are worthy of mention here. One is that Dr. Joseph Warren and Paul Revere appear to have been direct liaisons or members of different Patriot clubs, and the only two that show up repeatedly. And the other is that Paul Revere, perhaps his most important ride, was to Philadelphia, a 5-day ride that carried the Suffolk Resolves from September of 1774 that made Massachusetts independent. And this is rather remarkable. It's lesser known, but last year was the 250th anniversary of that, and about 150 of us gathered at Milton Historical Society, which is where the Suffolk Resolves were. And it shows how trusted, in fact, Paul Revere was. And it's remarkable that his ride of 5 days to Philadelphia is not better known.
Yeah. No, I had the pleasure of both editing an article by Diane Ralph and of the Milton Historical Society, and hosting her on the Paul Revere House podcast. So she did both of those for us for the anniversary of the Suffolk Resolves. And also I was able to, I wear a lot of hats at my job. One of them is I run the Paul Revere House podcast. I was also able to interview the director of Liberty Hall in Philadelphia, which is the other end of that ride. So I agree with you that that's a really, really important ride. And, I'd love to make it a bigger part of people's understanding of the revolution, because that was bringing the Suffolk Resolves to the First Continental Congress. And it was really the larger body's kind of acceptance that Massachusetts had done this was really a turning point in the politics of the revolution. So thank you for bringing that up.
Sure, and it's really, it is quite remarkable. And the part that makes the Declaration of Independence actually an echo nearly 2 years later, because it talks about grievances, but it also talks about taking action. And there is that here today. And for those who may not know, look at Mass 250, because March 17 will be on a Tuesday, and that will be the big evacuation day here in Boston. That will have full parade, flyovers, historical reenactors, units from other states, really being the celebration of the independence of Massachusetts, fully accomplished because with the help of foreign subjects of the British Empire like George Washington, our predecessors drove the British out of Boston and freed Boston Port. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. Yeah, Sharon.
Tegan, I'm the town historian of Bedford, and I've am so interested to know that Paul Revere did not come to Bedford. Sometimes people are sort of hoping that he did, you know? George Washington didn't sleep here, and Paul Revere didn't come through here. There were other messengers that night. There were, how many? They say like 50 messengers who were out all over the countryside. Um, Messengers from Lexington, Nathan Monroe and Benjamin Tidd came over Page Hill and alerted the people that they could reach. Went as far as Concord, around through Lincoln, and back up to Lexington, a 20-mile ride that night. And there's oral history, which is always fun because you can't really say this happened, but it's a wonderful story. There's a man named Josiah Nelson who was appointed, as you say, this was all arranged. He was appointed in Lincoln if he got the word to warn the southern part of Bedford. So in the night on the 18th of April, he heard noise, woke up, ran outside and said, "Do you have word of the British?" Well, it was a British advance party. They were the British, and they conked him on the head with a sword. And he ran inside, and his wife bandaged him up, leaped on his horse, and came to Bedford and warned South Bedford that the regulars were out.
Wow.
There's my contribution from Bedford.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And there are so many cool town stories from this period of the Revolution, and I wish that I could just learn and even retain them all. I mean, there are so many towns with their own really fascinating participation. So it's always fun to hear the ones that are special to people. Other questions or
I was
comments?
I was all excited to hear your talk because I read Paul Revere's Ride, David
Great.
Get Fisher's. And
Hmm.
oh, I know all about Revere. I read this book. And then I looked in the front of the book, 1995.
Hmm.
Has a lot of new stuff been discovered since 1995?
I wouldn't say that there's a lot that's changed in our historical understanding about the ride itself. I think that Fisher's book is really kind of the authoritative book on the ride, especially Revere's portion of the ride. Um, there is work that's been done by a Boston historian, John Bell or J.L. Bell, about some of the other riders, the lesser known riders, which ones are real, which ones are kind of historical fiction that then became accepted as real. So there's been some good work around that doesn't change what we know about Revere's ride, just adds to what we understand. Um, Roughly contemporary with Fisher's book, Jane Triber wrote a book about Revere's kind of political life, which is called A True Republican. She's using Republican in the colonial sense, not the modern sense. And so that kind of fleshes out other parts of his life. And much more recently, there's a book by Rob Martello called Midnight Ride Industrial Dawn about Revere's career and especially the latter half of his career as an industrialist and the copper working and the foundry as well. And so there's been a lot that has been fleshed out. I mean, Fisher, I'm a little biased because Brandeis is my alma mater, but Fisher was very meticulous, and I think almost nothing in that book has been kind of overturned in consensus. There are some things that I think our executive director, who still our director and was at the time that book came out, disagreed with him on, such as specific artifacts that he was looking at, whether they were, again, certain or uncertainly associated with the Midnight Ride. But the substance of it, I think, our understanding has not changed since 1995. Sorry, you ask a historian a question, as I'm sure you know, and you will always get a more complicated answer than you bargained for. All right, well, thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for having me at your meeting. As I mentioned, the Paul Revere House has a number of different ways that we put content out there. We also have a lecture series. It's in the fall. We have a podcast. We have our website. So please feel free to get in touch, to come visit us in Boston, do any of that.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight.
Thank you very much.
Delight to be together. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Quite welcome.
Close it.